Amy had always considered herself someone who could handle anything life threw at her. She prided herself on being independent, resilient, and resourceful. But that day in early spring, when she collapsed in agony on the floor of her small apartment, all of that self-reliance suddenly felt like a distant memory. Her hands trembled as she clutched her stomach, beads of sweat forming on her forehead as waves of pain shot through her body. She couldn't stand up. She couldn't even call out to her son, Lucas, who was playing with his toy cars in the living room. The sharp, stabbing sensation in her lower abdomen felt like nothing she had ever experienced before. And a terrifying thought crept into her mind. What if I die here? What will happen to Lucas? Forcing herself to breathe through the pain, she reached for her phone, which had fallen just out of reach when she hit the floor. After what felt like an eternity, her fingertips brushed the edge of the device, and with a surge of determination, she managed to grab it. Her fingers shook as she unlocked the screen and tapped on the first number that came to mind. Her mother. The phone rang 3 times before her mother, Karen, picked up. "Amy?" her mother said, her voice calm but tinged with that familiar undertone of irritation Amy knew all too well. "I'm in the middle of something. What is it?" Amy's voice was strained as she tried to speak through the pain. "Mom, I need help. I think something's wrong. I need to go to the hospital." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, something's wrong? Are you sick?" Karen asked, her tone more curious than concerned. "I think it's my appendix or something," Amy managed to say, her voice breaking as the pain intensified. "I can't move, Mom. I need someone to take care of Lucas while I go to the ER." Karen sighed audibly, as though Amy had just asked her to perform some monumental, unreasonable task. "Amy, you know I'm not good with little kids. Besides, I have plans tonight. Your father and I are going out to dinner." Amy blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. "Mom, I'm in serious pain. I can't take care of Lucas like this. Please, it's just for a few hours." Karen's voice took on that exasperated tone that always made Amy feel like a burden. "Amy, you chose to have a child. Lucas is your responsibility, not mine. I can't just drop everything every time you have a problem." Her heart sank. This wasn't the first time her mother had refused to help, but she had hoped, prayed, that this time might be different. "I'm not asking you to drop everything," Amy said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm asking you to help me when I really need it. Please." But Karen's tone didn't soften. "Maybe you should call someone else," she said. "What about one of your friends? Or Lucas's father? Oh, wait, that's right. He's not in the picture anymore, is he?" The jab at her ex-husband, Ryan, was like a slap in the face. Amy's grip tightened on the phone as a mixture of anger and desperation surged through her. "Forget it," she said through gritted teeth, ending the call before her mother could say anything else. For a moment, she just lay there, clutching the phone to her chest and staring at the ceiling as tears streamed down her face. She felt abandoned, humiliated, and completely alone. But she didn't have time to wallow in those feelings. Lucas's voice broke through her haze of pain and despair. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked, standing in the doorway with his big, innocent eyes filled with worry. Amy forced a weak smile, even as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she lied. "Mommy just needs a little help right now." She knew she couldn't rely on her parents, and with Ryan out of the picture, there was no one in her immediate family who could step in. But there was one person she could think of, her elderly neighbor, Miss Carmichael. The woman had always been kind to Amy and Lucas, often stopping by with homemade cookies or offering to watch Lucas for an hour or two when Amy had to run errands. She hated to impose, but at this point she didn't have a choice. Gritting her teeth against the pain, Amy dialed Miss Carmichael's number. The phone barely rang once before the cheerful, familiar voice answered. "Amy, dear, how are you?" "Miss Carmichael?" Amy said, her voice trembling. "I hate to bother you, but I'm not feeling well. I think I need to go to the hospital and I have no one to watch Lucas. Could you help me? Just for a little while?" "Of course, dear," Miss Carmichael said without hesitation. "You just sit tight, I'll be right over." Relief washed over Amy like a wave, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of guilt. Miss Carmichael was in her 70s, and Amy hated the thought of burdening her. Still, she didn't have any other options. A few minutes later, she heard a knock at the door, and Miss Carmichael stepped inside, her kind face filled with concern. "Oh, Amy, you look terrible," she said, hurrying to her side. "Let me help you up." With Miss Carmichael's assistance, Amy managed to get to her feet, though the effort left her feeling lightheaded and nauseous. Miss Carmichael led her to the couch and helped her lie down. "Don't you worry about a thing," she said. "I'll take care of Lucas. You just focus on getting better." Amy nodded weakly, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. She didn't know what she would have done without Miss Carmichael's kindness. The older woman stayed with Lucas while Amy called for an ambulance, and when the paramedics arrived, Miss Carmichael assured her that everything would be fine. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Amy stared out the window, her mind racing. Her parents' cruel dismissal replayed in her head over and over again, each word cutting deeper than the last. She couldn't understand how they could be so cold, so indifferent, especially when she needed them the most. But as much as it hurt, she knew she couldn't dwell on their rejection. She had to focus on herself and on getting through whatever this was, for Lucas' sake, if not her own. By the time she arrived at the hospital, the pain was nearly unbearable. The doctors quickly diagnosed her with acute appendicitis and scheduled her for emergency surgery. Lying on the gurney, staring up at the bright lights of the operating room, Amy felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She couldn't keep relying on people who didn't care about her. If her parents weren't willing to be there for her in her darkest moments, then she needed to stop expecting them to. It was a painful realization, but it was also the first step toward something she hadn't felt in a long time. Amy woke up in the hospital hours after her surgery, disoriented and groggy from the anesthesia. The sharp, searing pain that had dominated her every thought earlier was now a dull ache in her abdomen. The fluorescent lights above her flickered slightly, and the faint beeping of monitors filled the otherwise quiet room. For a moment, she simply lay there, her mind sluggishly processing where she was and what had happened. Then, as the fog cleared, her first thought was of Lucas. Panic surged through her chest. Had Miss Carmichael been able to manage him? He was just 3 years old, full of energy and curiosity. She hated the thought of leaving him with anyone for so long, especially an elderly woman who wasn't used to keeping up with an active toddler. Ignoring the discomfort in her body, she reached for her phone on the small table beside her bed. Her hands were still shaky, but she managed to unlock it and check her messages. There was one text from Miss Carmichael. "Lucas is doing just fine, dear. He's such a sweet boy. We had some sandwiches and read a few books before he fell asleep. Take your time recovering. He's in good hands." Relief washed over Amy, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to relax. She typed out a quick response, thanking Miss Carmichael profusely and promising to be in touch soon. As she set her phone down, her thoughts drifted back to the events of the day, the unbearable pain, the desperate call to her mother, and her parents' cold refusal to help. It wasn't the first time they had let her down, but somehow this time felt different. It felt final. Amy had grown up in a household where love was conditional, where her mother's approval was something she had to earn. As a child, she had tried her hardest to be perfect, getting good grades, keeping her room spotless, and never complaining, even when she felt neglected. But no matter what she did, it was never enough. Karen always found something to criticize, whether it was the way Amy dressed, the friends she chose, or the career path she eventually pursued. Her father, Richard, had been no better. He was a quiet, passive man who rarely intervened in Karen's harsh judgments. When Amy was younger, she had clung to the hope that he would stand up for her, that he would tell Karen to be kinder or more supportive. But he never did. He simply stayed in the background, nodding along with whatever Karen said. as though he was afraid to rock the boat. Amy had spent years trying to prove herself to them, hoping that one day they would see her as worthy of their love and support. Even after she became an adult, that desperate need for their approval lingered. She called them regularly, visited on holidays, and tried to include them in her life, even when they showed little interest. When she got married, Karen had criticized her choice of husband, saying Ryan wasn't ambitious enough for her. When Amy announced her pregnancy, Karen's response had been lukewarm at best, and Richard hadn't said much of anything, and when her marriage fell apart 2 years later, Karen had barely concealed her smug satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for the opportunity to say, "I told you so." Despite everything, Amy had continued to turn to them in times of need. She had clung to the hope that deep down they cared about her and Lucas. But their response today had shattered that illusion. They hadn't just refused to help, they had made it clear that they saw Lucas as a burden, as someone else's problem. Those words echoed in her mind, each repetition stinging like a fresh wound. You chose to have a child. Don't make him our burden. As she lay in the hospital bed, staring up at the ceiling, Amy felt a wave of anger rising within her. She wasn't just angry at her parents. She was angry at herself for allowing them to treat her this way for so long. She had spent years bending over backward to please them, sacrificing her own needs and desires in the hope of earning their approval. And for what? To be dismissed and belittled when she needed them the most? Her temper flared again when she needed them the most. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to cry over them anymore. Instead, she made a decision, a quiet, resolute decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. She was done chasing their approval, done letting their opinions dictate her self-worth, done expecting them to be the kind of parents she needed them to be. It was a sobering realization, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, Amy understood that she didn't need her parents' validation to be happy. She didn't need their approval to be a good mother to Lucas or to create a fulfilling life for herself. What she needed was to let go of the toxic cycle she had been trapped in for so long and focus on building a life that made her and Lucas happy, on her own terms. Over the next few days, as she recovered from surgery, Amy had plenty of time to think about what that life might look like. She thought about the kind of mother she wanted to be for Lucas. One who was present, supportive, and loving, in all the ways her own parents hadn't been. She thought about her career, which had stagnated in recent years as she struggled to balance work and parenting. And she thought about the people in her life who had truly been there for her, like Miss Carmichael, and how much she had taken their kindness for granted. By the time she was discharged from the hospital, Amy felt a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going to stop wasting her energy on people who didn't value her. Instead, she was going to focus on creating a support system that would lift her up, not tear her down. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments when she doubted herself, but she was determined to move forward. For herself and for Lucas. As she walked out of the hospital, Lucas ran toward her, his little arms outstretched. Miss Carmichael stood nearby, smiling warmly as she watched the reunion. Amy knelt down and scooped Lucas into her arms, holding him tightly as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of gratitude and hope. Amy thanked Miss Carmichael again and promised to keep in touch, feeling a deep sense of appreciation for the older woman's generosity. As they walked home together, Lucas chattering happily about the books he had read with Miss Carmichael, Amy felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She might not have been able to rely on her parents, but she had something even more important: the strength to rely on herself. This was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. One where she would no longer let the weight of her parents' disapproval hold her back. It was time to build a life that she and Lucas could both be proud of, a life filled with love, resilience, and the kind of support she had always longed for. The days following Amy's discharge from the hospital were a blur of recovery and reflection. Although her body was healing, she found herself grappling with a new kind of pain, the emotional aftermath of her parents' rejection. It wasn't the first time they had dismissed her needs, but this time it felt like the final straw. Their words, "Lucas is your responsibility, don't make him our burden," played over and over in her head like a cruel mantra she couldn't escape. But instead of succumbing to the familiar feelings of guilt and shame, Amy made a decision. She needed to set boundaries, real ones, and this time she wouldn't cave. The first step was distance. For years, Amy had been the one to initiate contact with her parents, texting or calling them weekly to check in. She had always done this out of a sense of obligation, even though those conversations often left her feeling worse about herself. Karen would complain about trivial things, criticize Amy's choices, or offer unsolicited advice about how she could fix her life. Richard, meanwhile, would remain mostly silent, chiming in occasionally to agree with Karen or make a vague comment about how things were different in his day. Amy realized she had been maintaining this relationship out of habit, not out of genuine connection or love. She had been chasing a version of her parents that didn't exist, hoping that if she just tried hard enough, they might finally show her the care and support she needed. But that hope was gone now, and with it, her sense of obligation. For the first time in her life, Amy decided not to call or text them. She deleted the reminders she had set on her phone to check in with Mom and Dad, a small but symbolic act that filled her with both anxiety and relief. She knew they would notice her silence eventually, and she braced herself for the fallout, but she also knew that she couldn't continue pouring energy into a relationship that drained her. The second step was focusing on herself and Lucas. For years, Amy had put her parents' needs and expectations ahead of her own. She had sacrificed her time, her happiness, and even her financial stability to try to win their approval. But now, she realized how much she had been neglecting her own well-being in the process. She couldn't be the mother Lucas needed if she was constantly battling feelings of inadequacy and resentment. It was time to prioritize her own growth and happiness. One of the first things she did was join a local single-parent support group. It wasn't easy for her to take that step. Amy had always been fiercely independent, and admitting that she needed help felt like a vulnerability she wasn't sure she could handle. But from the moment she walked into the community center and saw the circle of smiling, understanding faces, she knew she had made the right choice. The group was made up of people from all walks of life. Single moms and dads juggling jobs, childcare, and their own personal struggles. They shared stories, offered advice, and, most importantly, supported one another without judgment. For the first time, Amy felt like she wasn't alone. She could talk about the challenges of raising Lucas without feeling like a failure. She could share her frustrations about her parents without fear of being dismissed or criticized. The group became a lifeline for her, a source of strength and encouragement that she hadn't realized she was missing. At the same time, Amy began pursuing opportunities to improve her career. She had been working as an administrative assistant for a small company, a job that paid the bills but offered little room for growth. With Lucas in daycare during the day, she decided to enroll in an online certification program for graphic design, something she had always been passionate about but had never pursued seriously. It wasn't easy juggling work, parenting, and coursework, but Amy found herself energized by the challenge. She stayed up late after Lucas went to bed, poring over tutorials and creating designs that she felt proud of. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose and possibility. As she focused on her own growth, Amy also started to build a new support network. In addition to the single-parent group, she reconnected with old friends she had drifted away from over the years. Some of them had kids of their own, and they bonded over shared experiences and struggles. Others simply offered a listening ear or a much-needed break from the chaos of daily life. Amy was surprised by how many people were willing to show up for her when she reached out, and she realized how much she had been isolating herself in her efforts to manage everything on her own. Meanwhile, her parents began to notice her absence. A week passed without a call from Amy. then 2. Karen eventually texted her, a short and clipped message that read, "Haven't heard from you lately. Everything okay?" Amy stared at the message for a long time, her stomach churning with a mix of anxiety and resolve. In the past, she would have rushed to respond, eager to reassure her mother and avoid conflict. But now she saw the text for what it was, not genuine concern, but an attempt to reassert control. After taking a deep breath, Amy replied simply, "I'm fine, just busy." She hit send before she could second-guess herself and immediately silenced her phone. She knew her mother wouldn't be satisfied with that response, and sure enough, a flurry of follow-up messages arrived within minutes. "Busy with what? You could at least call your parents once in a while. Is this about that hospital thing? I already told you we had plans." Amy didn't respond. Instead, she let the messages sit unanswered, a small but significant act of defiance. She wasn't going to let her mother guilt her into resuming their toxic dynamic. If Karen truly cared about repairing their relationship, she would need to approach Amy with genuine humility and accountability. Something Amy knew was unlikely to happen. As the weeks turned into months, Amy found herself growing more confident in her decision. She still thought about her parents sometimes, especially during moments when she wished she had a family she could rely on. But those thoughts were no longer accompanied by the same sense of longing and self-doubt. Instead, they were replaced by a quiet determination to create the kind of life she and Lucas deserved, a life filled with love, kindness, and mutual respect. One evening, as Amy tucked Lucas into bed, he looked up at her with his big, innocent eyes and asked, "Mommy, why don't we see Grandma and Grandpa anymore?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. But then she realized that this was an opportunity to teach Lucas an important lesson about boundaries and self-worth. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people in our lives don't treat us the way they should. And when that happens, it's okay to take a step back and take care of ourselves. It doesn't mean we don't love them. It just means we need to make sure we're happy and safe." Lucas seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "Okay," he said simply. "I love you, Mommy." Amy smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I love you too, sweetheart. Always." As she turned out the light and closed the door, Amy felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. She was no longer living for her parents' approval or anyone else's expectations. She was living for herself, and for Lucas. And that was more than enough. The sun shone brightly through the windows of Amy's modest apartment as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee. It had been almost 6 months since she had decided to distance herself from her parents, and though the initial transition had been painful, she now felt a deep sense of clarity. The weight of their disapproval no longer bore down on her shoulders. The anxiety that used to grip her whenever her phone buzzed with a message from her mother had disappeared. For the first time in her adult life, Amy felt free. The changes in her life weren't just emotional, they were practical too. The certification program she had enrolled in was nearly complete, and Amy had already begun applying for graphic design jobs. She had even taken on a few freelance projects, designing logos and promotional materials for small businesses in her area. The work was creatively fulfilling, and it gave her a glimpse of a future where she could provide for Lucas without feeling trapped in a job she didn't love. Her mornings were now a blend of quiet, productive routines. She would wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and spend an hour working on her portfolio before Lucas woke up. After dropping him off at daycare, she would head to the community center to meet with her single-parent support group or work on her designs from the library. It wasn't an extravagant life, but it was hers, and she was proud of what she was building. But as much progress as Amy had made, there were still moments of doubt. She occasionally wondered if she had made the right decision in cutting ties with her parents. Were Lucas and Karen sitting at home talking about her in hushed tones? Did her father miss her, even if he hadn't expressed it? Those thoughts crept in late at night when the apartment was quiet, and the rest of the world seemed to be moving on without her. One evening, as she was tucking Lucas into bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Amy glanced at it and saw her mother's name on the screen. Her chest tightened instinctively, but she didn't answer. She had been sticking to her boundaries, only responding to Karen when it felt absolutely necessary, and she wasn't going to break that resolve now. After reading Lucas a bedtime story and kissing him goodnight, she sat on the couch and opened the message. It read, "I don't know what's going on with you lately, but you're being very selfish. We're your parents, Amy. Don't forget that. Call me." Amy stared at the screen for a long time, the words stirring a familiar mix of anger and guilt. But instead of responding, she closed the message and put the phone down. She had nothing to say to Karen. Not until her mother was ready to take accountability for her actions. Amy knew that day might never come, and she had begun to make peace with that reality. The turning point came a few weeks later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Amy was at a park with Lucas, watching him run around with a group of kids from the single-parent group. The air was crisp and filled with the sounds of children laughing and parents chatting. Amy sat on a bench, sipping from a water bottle and basking in the sense of community she had found. As she watched Lucas climb to the top of the playground structure, a voice startled her. "Amy?" She turned and saw a familiar face. Her older brother, Daniel. He was standing a few feet away, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been older than 5. Amy hadn't seen Daniel in over a year. They had grown distant over the years, partly because he lived in another state, and partly because he had always aligned himself with their parents. He had been Karen and Richard's golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and though Amy loved him, she had often resented how effortlessly he seemed to earn their approval. "Daniel," she said, standing up and trying to mask her surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I'm in town for the weekend," he said, his tone cautious. "I thought I'd bring Lily to the park for a bit." He gestured to the little girl, who was now shyly hiding behind his leg. "Say hi to your Aunt Amy, Lily." Lily peeked out and gave a small wave, and Amy felt a pang of emotion. She hadn't even met her niece until now. After an awkward pause, Daniel sat down on the bench next to her. "I've been meaning to reach out," he said. "Mom and Dad told me you've been distant lately." Amy let out a dry laugh. "Distant. That's one way to put it. They're worried about you," Daniel said carefully. "They're not worried about me," Amy replied, her voice firm. "They're worried about control. There's a difference." Daniel frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he looked down at Lily, who had wandered off to play with some of the other kids. "You know, I've been thinking about how they treated you," he said after a moment. "It's different from how they treated me. I didn't see it before, but I get it now." Amy's heart skipped a beat. For so long, she had felt like no one in her family truly understood what she had gone through. To hear Daniel acknowledge it, even in a small way, felt like validation she hadn't realized she needed. "I'm not cutting them out to be spiteful," Amy said softly. "I'm doing it because I need to protect myself and Lucas. I can't keep letting them hurt me." Daniel nodded slowly. "I get that, and I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you were alone in it. I should have been there for you." Amy felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." They spent the next hour catching up, talking about their lives and sharing stories about their kids. By the time they said goodbye, Amy felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she couldn't change her parents, but she could still rebuild her relationship with Daniel. It wasn't the perfect family she had always dreamed of, but it was something. As the months passed, Amy continued to build the life she had envisioned. She landed a part-time graphic design job with a local marketing agency, which allowed her to spend more time with Lucas while also pursuing her passion. She stayed connected with the friends she had made in the single-parent group, and she even started dating again, a slow, tentative process that reminded her of her worth. One evening, as she sat at her desk working on a freelance project, Lucas came up to her holding a crayon drawing. "Look, Mommy," he said, beaming with pride. Amy took the drawing and smiled. It was a picture of the two of them standing in front of their apartment, holding hands. Above them, he had written the words, "Me and Mommy," in big, wobbly letters. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I'm going to hang it on the fridge." As she pinned the drawing up, Amy felt a deep sense of contentment. Her life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but she knew she was on the right path. She had learned to let go of the people who didn't value her and to embrace the ones who did. Most importantly, she had learned to value herself. And for the first time in a long time, Amy felt truly at peace.